For half a century, WJPZ Syracuse has been the greatest media classroom on the planet.
We've trained students from the 1970s to the 2020s on how to run a professional radio station.
But the lessons learned and relationships formed go far beyond studios and transmitters.
Taking a look back through the eyes of those who experienced it.
This is WJPZ at 50.
Welcome to WJPZ at 50. I am John Jagay. Full disclosure, I am meeting today's guest for the first time. I had him tell me who he has stayed in touch with either from school or since school. And I asked, full disclosure, all those people about him. And what I kept getting over and over from everybody were the same three things. That John is as talented as he is kind, as he is successful, as he is funny, and on down the line. From the class of 95, John Beck, welcome to the show.
Thank you. You forgot handsome. They didn't say handsome? How dare they?
I should say handsome because it is only audio and they can't see you. So I apologize for leaving that out.
You gotta paint the picture. It's radio.
Radio, baby. Began to Rick Wright impressions later on for sure.
Hey, baby.
So let's start at the beginning. Where did you grow up? How did you find out about Syracuse and then the radio station?
Well, let me actually start, if you don't mind. I wanted to start with an apology.
Okay.
Because you've been asking me to do the podcast for forever, and I haven't quite gotten back to you, and I apologize. I have to say, I feel a little bit like a fraud coming onto the Z89 podcast because I was never like a Z89 guy. I loved my time there, but I was actually a UUTV guy and was kind of recruited by Dave Gorab kind of outside the system. I was the general manager of the TV station, and one day Dave Gorab kind of came over, and I had done a bunch of different comedy shows over there. Sketch comedy called Null and Void, and just a bunch of comedy things there. And my good friend Julian Keel had been working at Z89, and Gorab came and approached us about coming in and taking over the Crazy Morning Crew, which seemed like fun to us. I didn't realize that was the position that everybody kind of worked towards getting, was the morning show. I just assumed that nobody else at the radio station wanted to get up that early in the morning and they needed somebody to do it. So I said, yeah, okay. So we kind of came into the station and could feel like these eyes, like, who are these guys? Like, he doesn't even know what overnights is. I'm like, yeah, I have no idea what overnights is. I'm here. So I always kind of felt a little bit on the outside of this fantastic family, which I really enjoyed being a part of, but never quite felt like it was my place to come in and celebrate that history, because I was just kind of there in a completely different way than most people got there. So I apologize. I am here now. BB Good twisted my arm a bit and decided I was being silly, and 9 times out of 10 BB is right, and the only time she's not right is when she thinks she isn't. So so anyway, I'm here. Thank you for inviting me, and I apologize that it's taken this long.
Not at all. And for the record, the only criteria to be on this podcast is you have to have worked at Z89. We have had WAER folks, we've had UUTV folks, and the various iterations of UUTV. And no matter how you got at the station, no matter what you did at the station, you're fair game. Since you mentioned Dave Gorab, I want to read you this from Dave Gorab in reference to you and the Crazy Morning Crew. I just remember a show that was always prepared and substantially smart funny. You know, the ones who make it seem easy, and the only reason it's easy is because they took the time to do the work, not just winging it. So you come off as modest here, John, but that's a pretty high compliment from somebody like Dave Gorab.
Listen, there's very few people in the world that I respect more than Dave, not only now, but back then. This is the guy who always felt like he had his shit together, like a grown-up amongst all of us idiots. So when Dave asked us to do it, of course we said, yeah, maybe the first mistake you've ever made, Dave, but yeah, we'll come do it. Like I said, Julian Keel was our friend who had actually gone through training at Z89. His big claim to fame on overnights is he was the DJ on air when comedian Sam Kinison died.
Okay.
Which was, I think, one of the greatest moments of Z89 history, in how wildly inappropriate Julian broke the news. He had kind of a high squeaky voice like, I'm sad to report that comedian Sam Kinison has died. Beat. But we're still rocking here at Z89 with here's Freak Me. So,
oh, that's great.
Somehow that was the guy who was allowed to run the board. And the rest of us just kind of hung out and goofed around, and yes, came in with prepared stuff, but I don't think ever quite realized until much later on what a position of privilege we were kind of put in, because Dave showed faith in us and knew that we were funny guys who he thought could handle this. And the crazy part is, and again, I'm not a radio guy. I don't even know necessarily what this means, but we're sitting there after we had done this for a couple of months, and Dave comes flying into our office over the TV station. He's like, the books just came out. I'm like, great. What is that? I have no idea what that means. He's like, oh, it's like the ratings, but for radio. And like our tiny little station for the morning show is now in the top 10, beating most of the professional stations in the market, which sounded great to us, but we didn't realize what a big deal that was until much later, because again, we didn't know what we were doing, and frankly, shouldn't have necessarily been given that position, but Dave had faith in us, and it was pretty cool to know that the things that we were doing were actually kind of getting out into the greater Syracuse area, and like we had schools that were requesting us to come in and teach science, because we had a character named Professor McPhibious that Brian Horace, another guy of ours, did. This guy just loved frogs, and they were studying frogs and wanted him to come in and teach their class, and it was pretty cool. If you could withstand the glares of the people who are like, I've done overnights for 3 years. These guys suddenly waltz in and do the morning show. So
you mentioned Professor McPhibious. What are some of the other bits you remember from the show?
Oh, God. A bunch of truly ridiculous things that we had a lot of fun doing. There's Professor McPhibious. There was Love Pumping Horace, who was basically a monotone guy who would just speak the lyrics to popular songs. You know, we stripped out all the lyrics to Mama Said Knock You Out and put a hip hop beat kind of underneath the guy. Just, I wouldn't even say it was spoken verse. It was just our friend Rob Schrader just reading the lyrics. We thought it was funny and people enjoyed it. I don't know. It was just kind of whatever came to mind that week. We went out of our way to make sure we were engaging our audience kind of on their level, which was, you know, we're all junior high and high school idiots at heart anyway, so that's kind of where we lived.
I'm told there were a couple of bits that did not get approved by Neon Dion and Dave Gorab.
Probably.
Let's see. I've got it in my notes here. Do you remember any off the top of your head before I come back to my notes?
No, go ahead. I'm a little nervous.
Let's see. In reference to Brian, there was a WWF bit that you wanted to do that didn't quite make it past muster, which you can tell with where Brian ended up. That makes sense, right?
I am quite sure that there were several of those. Every week Brian was, but I think he and Mike Connor were also pitching a wrestling talk show that also didn't make the grade. I'm not sure of that specific bit, but I'm positive that is correct.
That tidbit did come from Mike Connor, so you're spot on. See, I'm jogging your memory here. He also says he believes, you can tell me true or false on this, there was also a contest not approved, Name BB Good's breast. That is true. I frankly felt I should have won with Starsky and Hutch. Well, okay. Now, outside the radio station, I'm told there's a story of a trampoline. You recall that one?
Yes, that is 100% true. My friend Julian and I were walking through Sam's Club in Syracuse, and we're very proud that we had gotten accepted into the Sam's Club. And we walked in, and as we walked through the aisles, we just see this gigantic trampoline hanging from the ceiling, and it was like, oh, like the sky's open up. I'm like, oh, Julian's like, wouldn't it be great if we had that? I'm like, oh, we're going to get that. I'm like, we don't have the kind of money to buy that. I'm like, we're not going to pay a dime. He's like, what are you talking about? We're going to start a club. Just go with me on this. So I called literally everybody I knew and asked if they wanted to be in the We Own a Giant Trampoline Club. They're like, well, what do you mean? I'm like, well, we'll own a giant trampoline. Like, well, what do I got to do? Well, you pay $5 and you get to be in the club. Well, what's the membership get me? Like, well, you can come jump on it anytime you want. Oh, anytime I want. So if it's 3 a.m. and there's 3 feet of snow and I feel like I want to jump on a trampoline, like what happens? I'm like, your trampoline, dude, come on over. You're like, dude, I am so in. We literally raised enough money to buy this trampoline and stick it to the back of our yard, and then had like hundreds of dollars left over for beer money for the rest of the year for anybody who wanted to come over and jump on the trampoline.
Oh, that's tremendous.
Which was pretty fabulous, except for one thing. We never approved it with our landlord, so we just had this gigantic trampoline with everybody on the face of the planet coming in at, again, 3 a.m, having just been out at Chuck's or Fagan's and jumping on the trampoline. So it's a massive liability in hindsight as a grown-up now, but at the time it was pretty cool. But when we graduated our senior year, what are you going to do with a trampoline? There's still plenty of people on campus who are part of the club. So we gave it to a friend, and their landlord wasn't nearly as lenient as ours. And so they'd take the trampoline down, and piece by piece, the trampoline started to disappear. Everybody's like, well, what happened to the trampoline? they were living in an area that also had like some actual families living. And one day their neighbor came walking down. I was like, oh, I just want to thank you so much for giving my son Tommy that trampoline. Like, what are you talking about? And it turns out this kid down the street saw this trampoline taken apart and came and stole the trampoline piece by piece and reassembled it in his backyard.
That's commitment.
Which I thought was the greatest way for membership of the trampoline club to finally close, as some other kid kind of outsmarted us.
Oh, that's funny.
I will say We Own a Giant Trampoline Club is a story that I do tell a lot of high school kids, but mostly college kids about, and frankly, some adults who are kind of starting out in this business. Sometimes things can seem completely overwhelming until you break it down into small pieces. Once something isn't like a gigantic task and it's a series of small tasks, if you could just do one of those tasks over and over and over, eventually you get to the end, and these big insurmountable things that you don't think you can make happen or break through eventually end up becoming much easier to grasp once you break them down into smaller, more accomplishable tasks.
Some people eat an elephant, you buy a trampoline.
Exactly.
And you had someone that was there when I was there. I graduated in 02. Professor Schoonmaker and his kids came and played on the trampoline too, I'm told.
Professor Schoonmaker was a member of the We Own a Giant Trampoline Club, and as talented and as handsome as that guy was, I was stunned at how coordinated he was on the trampoline. He got some serious air and did some corkscrews and seat drops, and you name it. He was fantastic.
You mentioned the whole breaking a larger task into smaller pieces. Are there any other lessons you can think of from your time on the Crazy Morning Crew and at Z89 that have served you well in your tremendous career that we'll get to here shortly?
Don't be afraid to try things. They may not work. They may not be any good, but even if it isn't a home run, you learn more by failure than you do by success. And if there's something that doesn't work, you could figure out why it didn't work. And the next time you do it, you do things differently. I think there's far too many people who don't put themselves out there and try something to see if they can make it work. Especially in comedy, it's tough to be perfect right out of the gate. You've got to give some things a try. You've got to be vulnerable and kind of throw yourself out there.
You mentioned comedy. You have been associated with some very well-known shows throughout your career. Take me through moving out to LA after graduation and your career arc since.
Well, you asked before, I grew up in a small town in northwestern Pennsylvania. Mm-hmm. After high school, I graduated, went to Syracuse for 4 years, and after that, realized I wanted to get into the entertainment business, scripted television. So I packed all my worldly belongings into my shitty Ford Tempo and hit the highway and, ended up moving out to LA and kind of crashing on couches for a couple of weeks before kind of landing that first gig. I started out as a production assistant on a show called Boy Meets World. Mm-hmm. Production assistant is the person who does everything. At the time, we'd copy scripts, we'd get lunches, we would run errands. You literally do everything, and you're there from 9 in the morning until 2 in the evening as the writers rewrite stuff. And then back in the old days, then you would copy scripts for a couple hours and drive things around. Now you kind of email it, and there's not nearly as much nighttime work. But that was my very first gig. Is after 4 years of glorious Syracuse education, I was getting lunch for Corey in Topanga.
Oh, Topanga. That's the 7-year age difference between us, because I think in college, many of us in the dorm had many conversations about Topanga. You were working for her at the time.
Exactly. Well, at the time, you realize, my job is getting 14-year-olds their lunch. So I really worked very hard to make it in this business. But at the same time, I like to say there's two things. There's your job and there's your career. Mm-hmm. And you have to work equally hard at both if you want to advance. So my job at the time was working as a production assistant, but my career that I wanted was being a writer. So, once you're done for the evening, copying scripts and doing your job, late evenings and weekends were dedicated to writing sample scripts and getting good at putting pen to paper and writing sample episodes of sitcoms that were on the air and spec pilots. I ended up hooking up with a writing partner named Ron Hart, who's also a Syracuse guy who's familiar to many of your Z89 people. So we started writing together at the end of 95. Ron was a senior when I was a freshman at Syracuse and was the guy who threw cool parties at school. So when I went out to LA, I'm like, I got to find that Ron guy. At the time, he was working. He was kind of waiting for LA to find him while doing the worst possible jobs you could possibly think of doing out here in Los Angeles. He was a maid for a while. He was a taxi driver for a while. Okay. He was kind of having that Kerouac experience while waiting for Los Angeles to discover him. So by the time I got out, he was like, yeah, you might want to just get a PA job, which was probably the better idea. After Boy Meets World, I worked briefly on Ellen the year Ellen won the Emmy for coming out, but was only there for about a month at the very beginning of that season, and then jumped over to a show called Unhappily Ever After as a writer's assistant, which was a step forward because I was actually finally in the writer's room with writers. I wasn't a full-time writer yet, but I was kind of writing down what they say and kind of got to be in a room and kind of see how those when I say a room, I mean a writer's room.
Yeah.
Where a bunch of writers, a bunch of funny people sit around a conference table trying to crack each other up all day and coming up with stories. After that, I moved over to a show called Grace Under Fire for the final season. And then I was on a show called Damon briefly, and then eventually ended up on a show called The Hughleys.
Yeah.
Which is where I got my first staff job. Granted, if there's a 3-year journey where Ron and I were out pitching shows and writing freelance episodes of anything that would possibly give us any kind of a look. But finally on the Hughleys is where we had made it to a place where it's like, okay, we can quit our day jobs and now we're full-time professional writers. So the Hughleys lasted for 4 seasons. 4 seasons, 2 networks, 10 different time slots, 90 episodes of a series that people are starting to remember it a little bit now. It actually comes out on Netflix this summer, but it was one of those ones that people feel like, oh yeah, I've heard of that show, but didn't quite always know what it was, depending on where you were. After that, we jumped over to a show called According to Jim that lasted for 8 seasons. And BB told a very fantastic story about how we got BB good on network television as playing herself as a radio DJ, which was so much fun. But I did not know BB told this story during her podcast. I didn't know she was going into contractions while she was signing her contract. That is literally the first time I heard that story was when I listened to the podcast. So I adore BB.
And that's the beauty of the podcast and talking to so many people from 50 plus years of the radio station is, oh, I know that story, but oh, there's a wrinkle that I didn't know and no better example of that one. If you haven't listened to BB's podcast, please go back and listen to it. You'll be smiling from ear to ear the whole time you hear it. But anyway, continue. I cut you off.
You know, speaking of wrinkles, if I could take a quick tangent, because there's a story that, well, you'll see for many reasons, I don't exactly remember all of this story.
Okay.
And I'm still trying to piece together, maybe somebody could solve this mystery. Back as Z89, there was a day where they decided to do for drunk driving awareness.
Yes, I want to hear your recollection of this story, yeah.
Okay, great. They brought in the Syracuse Police Department. They were going to administer, basically we're going to drink on the air. They were going to measure our blood alcohol, or breathalyzer.
Yeah.
And one person was supposed to be drinking hard alcohol. One was supposed to be drinking beer. One was supposed to be drinking wine, I believe. And I was supposed to be running the board.
Okay.
And somebody didn't show up. And it was Carl Weiser, well, Johnny Budweiser at the time, Betty Keston, who was Goofy Betty.
Yeah. And
there was supposed to be a third person who was supposed to be one of the people who was getting fed the booze by the cops. And that person didn't show up. So they're like, oh, they grabbed me from the board, like, okay, you're going to be one of the people who is drinking today. I'm like, oh, okay, show must go on. Now, at the time, I'm like 19 years old, but they told me, okay, this one, I didn't want the show to not do well. Plus, hey, get a chance to get drunk in the morning. Fantastic. I had always thought for some reason it was Kid Michael Rock who was supposed to be there and wasn't there. But we have since asked around and he doesn't have any recollection of that at all. So somebody jumped in and ran the board. It might have been Jeannie.
Okay.
And then the 3 of us basically got trashed on the air. And I had work I was supposed to go to directly after the show. And we ended up getting hammered. And I think I might have bitten Carl Weiser on the shoulder at one point. And he got all kinds of mad because I didn't use his air name. And I'm at Denny's trying to sober up and realize, oh, I never called in to work to let them know I wasn't going to be there. And turns out they were listening to the show and realized there was no way in hell I was coming in. So. But I don't know who that third person was supposed to be. I can't remember.
I will say this. If you would like the answer to John's question or the rest of the puzzle, go and listen to Goofy Betty's episode because she tells the story quite well in hers. So if you combine Betty and John and a few others we had throughout the series, you'll be able to put that story together. But the cops never found out you weren't 21, right?
No, I was able to keep my mouth shut about that. Just not about, I know Carl Weiser was lividly upset that I wouldn't use his air name, Johnny Budweiser. I kept calling him Carl Weiser. He's like, you're going to ruin everything. You're ruining the whole mystique. Like, I didn't know you had mystique, Carl. All right, go get him.
You mentioned Kid Michael Rock. He sent a really nice note when I asked him about you. He talked about when you were working with the Disney Channel and you were working with Liv and Maddie. And he reached out to you, I believe. So Dove Cameron was pitching her song at his radio station. You put in a word for Dove Cameron, and she had great things to say about you. But you actually ended up sending Michael an autographed picture of the entire Liv and Maddie cast, signed by all of them. It was for his daughter. She was 9 years old at the time, and she still has it hanging in her room.
Oh, that's awesome. That is one of the great things about, we talked a little bit, I've worked in network television. I've worked in streaming television for edgier things. I worked on Disjointed, which was about a pot dispensary. I worked on Fuller House, which is, kind of bridge between family and kids. But I've worked a lot in kids television on Disney Channel and Nickelodeon.
Yeah.
And one of the coolest things about working in kids television, as much as I worked in kids TV, is you will never in your life have an audience more appreciative of your product than when you work in kids TV. Mm-hmm. Whether it's receiving a signed script or whether it's coming to a live show and getting to meet the people that you watch on TV, it's like getting to hang out with Santa Claus all day long, because kids light up and you realize, oh, there's not an audience in television that is more affected and appreciative of your product that you're putting out there than, kids from 6 to 14. And it's a real pleasure for me to be able to kind of provide that especially for, the kids of friends of mine and you name it. BB came and brought the whole Goodman clan to the set one day. So that was fun. You never know who's going to be in the stands. I believe it was the Hughleys. I'm not positive. It's either the Hughleys or, according to Jim, during a live audience at one point, I turned around and looked up and I'm like, oh my God, I think that's Kafele and Dion from Z89 sitting up in the stands. And it turns out it was, and they had no idea I was going to be there. I had no idea they were going to be there. So you never know. It's just a fun way to reconnect over.
This episode of the podcast has a bit of a different flow to it because I've got all these notes in front of me. But you mentioned that. You are absolutely right with that memory, because Kafele writes, Dion and I went to go see a taping of the Hughleys.
Yes.
Beck saw us after the show wrapped and invited us down to the wrap party, introduced us to the cast, and let us roam free, where we met the Marla Gibbs, who was leaving with a classic Mama double plate, when you use a second plate on top, full of drumsticks. Yes, they had wings, but it was all drums, no flats, baller. John is one of the nicest people I know and one of the funniest.
Oh, that's ridiculously kind of him. But yes, Marla is a force of nature. We had a writer on the Hughleys who, and for those of you who don't know, Marla Gibbs played Florence on the Jeffersons, was on a show called 227. She played DL's mom on the Hughleys, and not coincidentally, we did this on purpose. DL's wife's dad was played by Sherman Hemsley, who played George Jefferson. So we kind of got a little mini Jefferson reunion. But one of our writers had actually been a writer on 227 back with Marla back in the day. So when we cast Marla, you could see this guy's name is Bootsy. And Bootsy, you could see a hint of fear that suddenly was in his eyes. Like, what's going on? He's like, Marla's tough. And so Marla showed up on day one and hadn't seen Bootsy in probably 20 years, but handed him her shopping list to type up for her, because he was a writer, and apparently that's the thing he did back on 227. But Marla got what Marla wanted, so it does not shock me at all she walked out with all the drumsticks.
Kid Michael Rock and Kafele and Gorab and all these names, are there names that you form good relationships and friendships with at the station that we haven't gotten to yet, that we haven't mentioned?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, my group was Julian Keel and Brian Gewirtz. The three of us were Crazy Morning Crew for, I think, 3 out of the 5 days or 2 out of the 5 days. And then Carl Weiser, Johnny Budweiser, and Goofy Betty were the other day. Eventually, Julian got an internship with David Letterman, so he was gone the second semester. I happened to have my radio license from a class I took in high school. So I was running the board. We brought in a guy named Joe Davis to kind of take over Julian's spot and kind of finished out second semester with that. And it was nice. We started to get to know some of the other people there a little bit. Again, we were kind of the outsiders who would show up at 6 a.m. when nobody was around, and we'd be gone by the time people would show up. So we didn't know a ton of people, which was why it made such an impression on me when people like, BB and Betty and Dave Gorab and Kid Michael Rock and some of these other people kind of reach out a little bit because we didn't really know a whole lot of people. Tina Mussolino just showed up one day. Tiolino, I think, was her air name at the time. But she showed up. She's like, I'm your producer. I'm like, what? She's like, oh, yeah, I'm making promo. I'm like, oh, okay. We've got like somebody showing up. Like, great. So she was always particularly kind and nice to us. You know, we love Dion. We love Kefele. Big Daddy.
Marvin Nugent, yeah.
Another fun guy. Jordan Guayumi, who I think Jordan Wilder was his air name.
That's correct.
I know early on he was always irritated that we like didn't know what we were doing. He's like, well, you can't play that song in the A block of there, but where's your training? I'm like, he doesn't know we had no training. I don't know.
I can picture this as you're describing it, yeah.
But later on, once the books came out, it's like, oh my God, you're doing great. We gotta... At one point, I believe it was Jordan arranged for us we're going to go skydiving live on the air.
Oh, wow.
Which sounded like a blast to me. Never happened. Because Brian Gewartz, one of our other guys, like, wait a second, I don't want to do this. I'm like, okay, you don't have to. He's like, you guys should not do this. I'm like, well, why should we not do this? He's like, doesn't make any sense. We could just pretend that we're skydiving. It's radio. Nobody actually, I'm like, but then we can't go skydiving for free. So he pitched such a fit that finally Jordan pulled the plug on the whole thing, I believe, which was a bummer because it would have been fun. But Jordan was always nice. I think there's a guy named Ed Brundage who was always really nice to us.
Mm-hmm.
Our campus spotlight people, Mook and Hannah, were very nice.
Any Rick Wright stories that come to mind?
I have a ridiculous amount of Rick Wright stories. Rick not only did like one of the very first people I met on campus, I'm like, oh God, that guy's awesome. The only writing class I ever took at Syracuse was Rick's writing for commercial radio class.
Okay.
And Rick came walking in that first day. I was like, hey, baby, who likes to make money? And just started drawing dollar signs on the on the chalkboard in front of us. I'm like, I like to make money. Rick's like, hey, JP, you get an A. JP gets an A for the day. Who else like to make money? And suddenly everybody else is raising their hands. Later on, Rick ended up at some Navy reunion thing and came in like the weekend. I was like, hey, JP, guess who I met at the Navy reunion? I met JP's grandfather at the Navy reunion. We had a blast dance with all the ladies. We had a good time, me and JB's grandfather. Hey, your grandfather still wearing his Navy uniform. Hey, baby. All right. So, yes, I loved Rick, loved him to death. Ended up taking a performance class later with Rick, basically because we knew it would be a blast. The other people in the class didn't necessarily like to have us around because they were very serious broadcasters trying to learn how to deliver properly to the camera. And it was me and Mike Murphy and others. There's a bunch of the sports guys I got along with really well. Mm-hmm. It was me and Mike Murphy and Mike Connor and Brian Gewartz. We're all in this class just kind of screwing off the whole time. And regardless of what we did, Rick always like thought we were just having a great time and kind of rewarded us for it because
you're part of the family.
He's like, yeah, radio is supposed to be fun, babe. Performance, the glass sandwich you love. You got to be out there having fun.
Oh, I haven't heard the glass sandwich you love in a long time. Thanks for bringing that one back.
Glass sandwich you love, baby. So at one point, we literally, there's no way Rick should not have yelled at us because we screwed up the teleprompter for somebody else's thing and they were upset. And they're like, Professor Wright, they completely screwed this up. And he looks at them, looks at us, looks at them, looks back at us, looks at them, like, hey, don't be a slave to technology, baby. Sometimes a teleprompter is going to screw up. Gotta have your hard copy. So we still ended up getting an A in the class. So
you got to lead the technology was always something he used because I was there when voice tracking had started. Oh, you got to lead the technology. I can't do a Rick impression. I'm not gonna debase myself because so many others do it so much better than I do. But yes,
the wild child has just been shot.
The wild child's been shot. We could go all day with this. Forgive the hard pivot here because this is something I want to ask you about. We've had a lot of laughs so far. You've been involved in the recent strikes in Hollywood. For somebody who has never spent time in Hollywood, for somebody who doesn't understand the business of it, can you give me a 101 primer of what this was all about and why it was so important to you?
Yeah, there's a couple of different things, and I'll try to thumbnail these as best as possible. It was important for the writers to make sure that source material, the things were not generated by AI, because once that happens, you take the writer out of the process.
Yeah.
And once that happens on a very basic business level, you don't get health and pension contributions. You don't get any rights to any rewrites or residuals. You don't get, basically, had we not had this strike, they very easily could have had AI generate a script and hire one writer to rewrite an entire season instead of having 20 writers who were there to kind of come up with a season. And regardless how bad the AI generated script was, you hire one person to rewrite that and you basically kill 19 jobs. So that was the AI part of it.
Okay.
The actors had a completely different AI part, which you're seeing a little bit now with there's the fake George Carlin podcast is coming out now where you can literally generate material images and voices that don't actually exist. So you can kind of take the actor out of it, writer out of it. And if you don't need actors anymore, then suddenly you don't need directors. You don't need sets. It was a very existential thing as far as making sure humans still get to be employed to do this thing we do. The other thing that was a very big part, there are several unwritten rules or unwritten ways of doing business that had been going for 60 years in Hollywood.
Okay.
Things like you need to hire writers. And none of these things were written down, that the showrunner had to be a writer. The way writers get paid is we're paid episodically.
Okay.
So you're paid by the number of episodes you're there produced. So if you're there for 6 episodes of production, you get a certain amount per each episode that's produced. But there's nothing that's said in the contract that you had to keep people around to produce the episodes. So basically, majority of this strike was the streamers. When I say streamers, I mean Netflix and Hulu and Disney Plus, you name it.
Sure.
More Netflix than anybody else. They decided, if these unwritten rules aren't written down, we're not doing it.
Okay.
So what was going on is they would hire some writers to break an entire season of a series and hire everybody at minimum for, let's say, 8 weeks, and then fire everybody by the time you started producing episodes.
Oh.
So nobody ever got the produced episode rates. You would just get your minimum for the 10 weeks that you were there.
I see.
Which ended up being obviously a major problem for writers that, as far as making the money that they use to live on. So much of it was writing things down like that. Also, way back in the day when everybody talks about residuals and everybody kind of knows, I think knows what residuals are. So you get paid for the reuse of the product that you create. That was initially it was an agreement between writers and directors and actors and the studios and networks where they said, okay, we understand that you're saying that the amount of money that people are wanting to charge isn't fair if you create something that people just aren't watching.
Okay.
So what we're going to do is kind of cut you a break, and it's a lesser amount for the shows that aren't necessarily doing well. But the shows that are doing well, that you end up rewriting or rerunning all the time and that are still generating business for you, here's some extra money that you get in success.
Okay.
And in broadcast, it was a certain amount of money. But once you got into streaming, that amount of money had been whittled down to next to nothing. Like I will get checks for 14 cents on things, which is fun and nice to get anything. But those residual checks are the way that writers and actors and directors get through the amount of time that they're not working.
Oh, right. Okay.
It's not a 52 weeks out of the year thing. And sometimes, there may be an entire year that you don't end up working on something. If you have been on something that has been out there and has generated profit for somebody else, you still get something coming in. But the streamers had such a low rate, and it was all the same. There was no, this show is doing extremely well, people should get a little more money on that. It was all exactly the same. And that didn't feel right for shows like Stranger Things should be getting a much higher residual than, to pick a random show, Big Shots on Disney Plus that didn't do nearly as well.
Okay.
So those are kind of 3 of the more main things as far as a strike. And it made sense for the companies to hold out as long as possible for this because it is a tremendous amount of money that they could have saved in the future. But the crazy part is the amount that we were asking for was so much smaller than the amount that they ended up losing because they didn't want to engage.
Yeah.
because it was worth it for them to potentially break a union and get everything at bargain basement prices.
I see.
So hopefully that wasn't too convoluted, but glad it is done.
No, thank you for that, because I think you see these headlines, or you might skim through social media and see, different perspectives on it, and hearing it from somebody who is actively involved with it and has been doing the work and has those legitimate concerns, I think really explains it well for a lot of people.
Basically, it boils down to it was forcing people to write down the unwritten rules that had been working for years and years and years and years and years. And you can't blame, these companies like Amazon and Apple and Netflix. They're tech companies more so than they are entertainment companies. Sure. And a tech company, what they do and what they traditionally do is automate, get rid of people, reduce cost. Like, that's how they're built. So you can't blame them for wanting to do that with this business, but this is a very human business. And that's basically what the fight was about, is how do we keep it so that people could still continue to do this for a living? And, especially with the actors, the majority of the actors that you see on TV, not the big stars, they're doing just fine, but your regular guest star actors, they're hurting a lot right now because you're not getting the same level of residual that you get. And if you're not a regular on a show, you're not getting that consistent paycheck. So basically just trying to get things to kind of level out where they always used to be.
Well, I appreciate the explanation. And one of the things we've hit on in the podcast is WJPZ being the world's greatest media classroom. So with that education piece in mind, you have had a tremendous career as a writer, showrunner, so many other things. What would you tell a 2024 Syracuse grad who wants to get into Hollywood and be a writer? What advice would you have for them?
Writers write. Mm-hmm. You will hear over and over and over and over and over as you tell people, I want to go out to Hollywood. You'll hear two things. You'll hear, it's all about being in the right place at the right time, mm-hmm. and it's all about who you know. Mm-hmm. Those things are true, but I like to kind of say them slightly differently. Yes, it's all about being in the right place at the right time, but I like to phrase that as it's about being prepared to take advantage of an opportunity when it presents itself, mm-hmm. because it will. And with writing, I cannot tell you the number of people who want to be writers but aren't writing anything. If you move out here and you work your ass off, get yourself on a show as a PA or you name it, eventually you'll get to a point where somebody says, oh, you want to be a writer? I'd love to read something you've written. You want to make sure that you're able to say, here you go. Get that to them an hour later, a day later. You're prepared to take advantage of that opportunity. If you say, oh, well, I'm working on this thing and I just need another 4 or 5 months, you've blown that opportunity.
Yeah.
That opportunity presented itself and you weren't prepared because you didn't do the work. Like I said, it's got to have equal time on your job and your career. If you spend too much time on just the job and not the career, you're not going to be able to take advantage of that opportunity. Flip side, if you spend all the time on your career and not your job, you can't afford to live out here anymore.
Yeah.
So it's got to be both. And yes, it's all about who you know, I guess, is what you hear from people. But and yes, it is a very relationship-driven business. But you already know the people that you need to know. You just don't know it yet, and they just don't know it yet. Building relationships is hugely important, whether it's the people that you graduated with. I tell everybody, it's like, okay, everybody who you move out with here, you need to not only get yourself in, you want to get everybody else in too. Mm-hmm. Your worst enemy, get that person a job. You can go back to hating them in 3 years once you guys are established. Get everybody in, and it's kind of ingrained in the Syracuse psyche.
Yeah.
Get everybody in because that is going to be your relationship network. Somebody's going to get in. They're going to hear about other stuff. They're going to pull you in. Every alumni who is out here has had that moment where somebody has helped them and given them advice and has pulled them in. Hugely important to give back and do that because, and they know what it feels like. We know what it feels like to be that person who's just come out here. So yeah, you're going to help out, whether it's with advice or whether it's with reading something or letting you stay on the couch, you name it. So yeah, it's about who you know, but you know these people as long as you're building relationships. You'll hear people it's like, oh, I've got a contact over at Warner Brothers. If you have a contact, you don't have anything. If you have a friend over at Warner Brothers, you got everything because a vouch is worth its weight in gold in this business. As I'm sure it is in any business, but it's especially out here. It's a very small town, Hollywood. Once you kind of figure out how to get in And then once you get in, you realize like you've got a whole group of people over here. It's like, oh my God, how do I get a job? How do I get a job? How do I get a job? Over here, you got a whole group of people saying, oh my God, how do I hire somebody good? How do I hire somebody good? How do I hire somebody good? You just need one person to go from this side to this side and then bring everybody with you. That's your relationship network.
I love that. And that is such an embodiment of everything that Syracuse, but Z89 especially represents in that family and that network and helping each other out. Before we wrap up, what are you up to now? What's next for you? We're recording this on January 16th. It's probably going to air around the end of February, beginning of March. But what's going on with you?
End of February, I'm currently doing a show called That Girl Lele on Nickelodeon. That should start airing the second half of season 2. Should be, I think, should be out by the end of February. Currently waiting to hear on a season 3. Been out kind of pitching new things. We just had a Christmas screenplay option that we hope can get made at some point here. It's weird. The strike ended beginning to mid of October, and the town is kind of taking its time kind of getting back up and running again. So we'll see. I think it's going to be a very different business. I feel like cheaper television is going to be important, and I don't mind that because frankly, TV doesn't have to be super expensive to be, at least on the comedy side of things, doesn't have to be expensive to be funny. You want people to get paid, but you don't have to spend a ridiculous amount of money in special effects to make a sitcom. So we'll see how things shake out. I'm optimistic about 2024, which is good because 2023 was not easy.
For so many of us, for so many different reasons. John Beck, class of 95, can't thank you enough for coming on the show. This was truly a lot of fun, and it was a pleasure to get to know you, hear your story, and get your perspective.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm really glad I did this. I was, like I said, I was a little nervous and felt like a bit of a fraud, but it's nice to feel part of something, and this podcast has helped me with that, and I really appreciate it, Jack.
That means a lot. Thank you very much.
The WJPZ at 50 podcast is created entirely by the staff and alumni of the world's greatest media classroom.
It's hosted by John Jag Gay, class of 2002. Editing help from James Bames Grundy III, class of 2020.
Imaging by Maureen Cooper, class of 1999.
And Ed Lacombe, class of 1985.
Podcast artwork by Marty Dundix, class of 2001.
Follow WJPZ at 50 on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube,
or wherever you're listening right now.